The Book of Kells is one of the world's most famous illuminated manuscripts. It is a massive hand-painted version of the Gospels created by Celtic monks around 800 AD, and it is on permanent display in the Old Library at Trinity College, Dublin in Ireland. The illumination of these pages is what makes it an illuminated manuscript. It was designed to hold a specific transmission, an energy that connects the one who reads and contemplates it with God. Transmission, yours, mine, the collective, is the topic of episode 8 today. And we begin with the mysterious story about the Book of Kells. The monks who created it used 24-karat gold leaf so that the pages shimmer and catch the light to pull the viewer's eye towards the eternal. To achieve the deep cosmic blues, they used lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone traded across thousands of miles from the mountains of Afghanistan, created by grinding the rock into a fine dust onto what's called the vellum, parchment paper made from the skin of calves. This kind of decoration is a masterclass in what is known as insular art, a distinct style that flourished in the monasteries of Ireland and Britain between 600 and 900 AD. In insular art, traditional Christian symbols are woven into a sea of indigenous, Celtic, and Anglo-Saxon ornate, swirling motifs. The human form intertwines with animals and mythical beasts, all held in the rhythmic pulse of Celtic knots and complex interlacing patterns. Here's the thing. Illuminated manuscripts are visual liturgy. Now, what do I mean by that? Liturgy refers to structured group rituals where repetitive actions and shared movements help people sync their focus and shift out of the mundane world and into a more spiritual state. Like, for example, a group of people bowing in unison or chanting together as you would see at a church service. This is what I mean by illuminated manuscripts being a form of liturgy. They were not meant to be read in the modern sense of, like trying to take in information cognitively. Rather, they were liturgical objects designed for lectio divina. That means divine reading, a 4-stage process of slow, rhythmic, and embodied contemplation. Every page of an illuminated manuscript is imbued with hidden symbolism. Every swirl and knot is a vital part of the architecture of the whole. The mind follows not just words, but symbols, creating a sort of contemplative, altered consciousness, which allows the Holy Spirit to transmit directly into the human nervous system. The illumination is therefore both literal and catalytic. The page is lit up by precious metals as paint, with the intention of it containing light of the divine. And the manuscript is meant to act as a tuning fork, recalibrating the human soul to resonate with the frequency of the divine order until the distinction between the observer and the transmission dissolves into a single lived experience of wholeness. Now for the mystery. In the year 1006, the Book of Kells was stolen under the cover of night. The thieves sought the gold and jewels encrusting its heavy cover. They ripped the manuscript from its casing and buried the hand-painted pages under a layer of damp earth. For over 2 months, the manuscript lay in dark, wet Irish soil. When it was finally recovered, so the story goes, the vibrant colors made from crushed semi-precious metals, stones, and rare minerals remained miraculously untarnished. Is the illuminated manuscript a living frequency, then, that remains intact even when buried by the world? Can burying something so holy actually dim its light? This mystery of a light that survives the dark, that is the subject of today's episode. Welcome back to The Shattering Place. I'm Michelle Dixon, and this is the podcast that explores the living science and true stories of multidimensionality in service to healing, awakening, and the evolution of consciousness. On our last episode, we learned that ascension or awakening is a natural, evolutionary, biological, even psychological process, something we might perceive as a kind of the soul or the divine's descent into the body, a process that even implicates the nervous system. We reclaimed the terminology of ascension and awakening from the distortions of popular culture, spiritual paywalls, and the myth of specialness. If you are just joining us, I invite you to listen to the previous episodes. They are the steps that take us from the shattering of our old lives to the building of a new, grounded capacity to be our full, multidimensional selves in the world. Today, we move into the eighth threshold, the illuminated manuscript. In this episode, we look at the idea of transmission, which is why I began with the Book of Kells. But in today's episode going forward, I am going to share how you are the manuscript. This episode shifts the focus from the internal discipline of human awakening to the external output of the individual's broadcast to the field. We will return to the concept of the ethics of resonance, how your very presence becomes a service to the evolution of the species. We'll begin by reviewing the concept of the transmission of the individual, briefly reiterating the message of episode 3, where we looked at the field, the glass mind, and the reality that there is no true or complete privacy of the mind. This is the most exciting bit, though. We are going to look at how the gift of awakening is the possibility of living your life as a healing transmission for the world around you. Is it possible that every action, word, and thought is a multidimensional event that ripples through the collective field? Let's talk about transmission. In this context, transmission refers to the constant broadcast of energy, thought, and frequency that every human being emits into the collective field. As established in episode 3, the glass mind is a reality in which there is no true or complete privacy of thought. On an energetic level, telepathy is a functional reality. Every individual is always broadcasting a signal, regardless of whether it is consciously perceived by another. Because this transmission is an ever present fact of our existence, the vital question becomes the refinement of the signal you send. A transmission can manifest in infinite ways. It can be clear and loving, or it can be discordant and aggressive. If we view or define the awakening experience as a shift towards wholeness and an alignment with the soul, we can view awakening as the ultimate clarifier for this signal. It is a fundamental move away from the static of the conditioned self and towards a state of systemic coherence. This movement towards a coherent transmission is a recurring thread throughout human history. The illuminated manuscript serves as a perfect example of this. It's a physical technology designed to tap into the divine and broadcast that frequency to the one who reads and contemplates the manuscript. For centuries, spiritual teachers, institutions, and their art have intentionally contributed to this collective field. These creations, from sacred music that elevates consciousness to the intricate vellum, those manuscript pages of holy texts, these are all essential because they anchor a specific high vibrational resonance in the world. Now, to illustrate how this works in practice, I'm going to share with you how I navigated this process within my own creative work, specifically how I wove a specific resonance or pattern into my novel IKONA in order to have an effect on consciousness. I'm going to use this as an illustration of how a creative output can hold frequency, not just sharing my story of how I did it, but also the research behind why it actually has an effect. Then I will return to the individual, to you, to explain how the awakening experience refines your own transmission, and in so doing, fundamentally impacts the collective. Now, I'm not giving away any spoilers for my novel, so if you haven't read it, no worries. You'll just approach it with a deeper than average understanding of the structure behind the story. So, I planned my novel Ikona to have a recursive structure, which I will explain in a moment, and also to have two patterns of psychological unfolding. But of course, I also wrote it to be fast paced, page turning literary thriller slash speculative fiction journey of four heroes searching for the origins of an ancient icon, a Russian Orthodox cross in this case, with the power to heal. So I'm not going to try to sell you the book. I'm not going to go into the story or why it's interesting. I'm really simply to talk about the structure and how I created it to have an effect. So in my story, in Ikona, the novel, there is another novel called Ikona, and the author of that fictional Ikona is a character in my novel. And in that novel, the Ikona within the Ikona, there is also a cross that heals. So there is a novel within a novel and an icon that has a fictional parallel. But again, the novel itself, my novel, is meant to be a living artifact, to be a living icon, to have a healing transmission. So that's the name, why it's also called IKONA. It is also an icon in a way. So already we have three iterations. So this is what I mean by recursive. A recursive structure is something that is defined by itself, something that repeats a process again and again. In this case, it is fractilic, so like a fractal, containing smaller version of itself within its own design. Think of a Russian matryoshka doll, those nesting dolls within dolls. You might think of the Fibonacci sequence if you can imagine that, the curve of that, what that looks like on a leaf. Fractals are created by repeating this simple process again and again, recursion. Each iteration produces a more detailed, complex version of the previous one. In nature, you might refer to recurring motifs like snowflakes, where the microscopic branches on a single arm of the snowflake follow the same structural pattern as the larger crystal. So, this was a motivation for me structurally for the novel. So, first of all, we have a story of a cross that heals within a story of a cross that heals within a novel named after a cross that heals. So, we have three recursive elements at the core, and some might say this is a mirror to the Holy Trinity. So in the world of my book, the icon heals the physical body, but it simultaneously provokes a consciousness experience, and it happens at all levels. That is the intention. So the recursive element in the form of these aspects of my book only becomes more complex because the structure itself is organized so that there are parts within parts. There is a past narrative of monks from the early 20th century in Siberia. There is a future timeline in the next century, and there is the present. The structure of the novel is recursive in the sense that the past is seated in the future is seated in the past. And this brings me to the why of this, beyond this kind of mathematical, geometric description of how I do it. It's all comes back to how fractals can induce different states of consciousness, right? Ranging from deep relaxation to heightened awareness. So it's rooted in a biological phenomenon called fractal fluency. And if you were to look at fractals at the repeating pattern visually, it would induce alpha brainwaves or a relaxed brain state. And eventually it would trigger an expanded state of consciousness. In fact, this fractilic brain state is what happens when you take psychedelics, for example. And it's what happens when you contemplate sacred geometry like that found in illuminated manuscripts, those Celtic knots I mentioned from the Book of Kells. So that's one way I structured it so that the story itself would have a fractal nature that would hopefully create this fractal fluency in the experience of the reader. But there are also two patterns of psychological unfolding that can be followed in the novel. And the first is the very well known hero's journey. So if you haven't read about the hero's journey or understand it, it will be linked in the show notes. Joseph Campbell, that was his greatest contribution, was really mapping this journey. It is a path, essentially, for tapping into a deeper level of psychological maturity. Following the characters as they follow this specific path creates a somatic and psychological effect of realization. The hero's journey maps the inherent potential of that kind of unfolding directly onto the reader. And I'm not the only one who's saying this. The science of storytelling actually shows that your brain syncs up with the hero through a process called neural coupling. Neuroscientist Yuri Hasson proved that a compelling story causes the listener's brainwaves to mirror the storyteller's in real time. That there is actually a chemical shift. Research by Dr. Paul Zak found that character driven stories with a classic dramatic arc, that is, they have tension and resolution, trigger a predictable chemical response in the brain, a surge of oxytocin and cortisol. Essentially, your brain simulates the hero's journey using your own nervous system to test drive the emotional stakes of the story. Antonio Damasio names this biological syncing at the chemical level somatic markers. So he calls it somatic markers, physical emotional tags that turn a story into a gut level truth. In other words, this syncing bypasses slow logical thinking. Because the story feels real in your body, your brain treats the hero's breakthrough as personally lived truth. So the story itself becomes like a tuning fork for your own future decisions and your own development or unfolding. Recent studies even prove that framing your life through this heroic structure directly increases your resilience and your sense of meaning. You might notice how the hero's journey has become kind of the golden child of life coaches, for example, as a tool for transformation. In any case, the narrative of a fiction story can act as a tuning fork for your nervous system, allowing you to restory your own life and anchor a deeper, coherent resonance within your cells. So, yeah, that happens in my novel, IKONA. There is the hero's journey, but not only that. I have done the same thing with the awakening narrative arc. Another passage that some of my characters experience, again, as the reader becomes immersed in what their story, how it's unfolding, is the awakening passage, this journey. And as I keep saying on this podcast, awakening is a natural evolutionary unfolding. The story provokes or catalyzes a remembrance in the self who is reading. That is my intention, because that can then open the reader up to a shift in consciousness. Now, essentially, I'm able to do this, or I was able to do this because I have had my own awakening journey. So it lived very deeply in my cells, and I was able to map that onto some of my characters. Now, in addition to this, also, some would say that the author's energetic signature lives in the story, and that therefore my essence is communicated through it. This might be so, and perhaps that is why I can weave this awakening experience in. But in any case, in summary, the transmission of a creative work lives in the narrative structure, the story arc, and the very energy of the creator. Fiction can function as a transmission. It might be of interest to you listeners that I did not do this consciously at all. I felt guided to create a very recursive structure that felt like liturgy, that felt like something very almost holy. Remember this term I used earlier. Liturgy refers to structured group rituals where repetitive actions and shared movements help people sync their focus and shift from the mundane world into a more spiritual state, like a group of people bowing in unison or chanting together, like a readership reading together across the globe. So, when early readers reported transcendent moments and somatic unwindings while reading IKONA, I understood why. Only after I wrote it did I look back and see what I had felt guided to create and precisely the effect it would have. Because in the moment, I felt like I was creating something very ritual, like stories within stories, motifs across time, certain rhythm, even. And the writing of it certainly changed my consciousness, but I didn't ultimately know what I was doing. There were chapters I had no recollection of writing. There were poems that came out in iambic pentameter that I only noticed afterwards. So there's no question that to some extent I did channel the narrative, but also I have written 3 previous novels and I have honed my craft for decades with discipline. Now, this matters. And this is where we come out of the IKONA story of the story and back to the topic of today's broadcast. It matters because the structure or container that we package an experience in, a poorly written story or one with lots of dodgy metaphors or grammatical issues, may have a structure but may not have the same clear transmission. So the structure matters. So you might notice a parallel here in what I have said about the embodiment piece of awakening, in that it requires a similar kind of mastering of the body or the healing of the nervous system in order to hold or embody the experience of higher consciousness. So the vessel matters, the structure matters. Master the vessel to hold the frequency. And of course, you can find links to my novel in the show notes and check it out for yourself if you're interested. Fiction is very personal. This same geometrical structuring that anchors a frequency in a novel or in an illuminated manuscript is exactly what occurs within your own nervous system. Whether we're talking about the transmission of an object or the transmission of a human being, we're still talking about a shift from a chaotic broadcast to a coherent one. So, back to the individual transmission. How do you, as an individual, affect the collective field with your own coherence? If we return to the awakening experience I outlined in episode 7, we can see that awakening acts as a functional clarifier. The transmission shifts from static, the fragmented noise of the conditioned self, into a clear, resonant signal. This is a movement towards a state of being that affects the field in a positive direction, naturally gravitating towards love, peace, and cooperation. This process is the fundamental transition from ego to soul. In this experience, the wounded or conditioned parts of the identity, those layers created by family expectations, societal pressure, or trauma, those parts begin to fall away. As they recede, the soul steps forward as the new engine of being. The part of the self that once acted out of conditioning begins to yield to a powerful inner impulse connected to the divine. This impulse carries an inherent sense of interconnection with all other beings and with consciousness itself. When the engine changes, the energetic signature of the person inevitably changes with it. This is a transmission of coherence that impacts the field of everyone in your proximity. This is mysticism, yes, but it is also a matter of resonance and physics. We have all experienced this in daily life. The discordant signal, for example. Consider the person who walks into a room or a party in a state of intense, unintegrated agitation. Even before they speak, the static of their field is palpable and disconcerting, right? It can cause people in the room to tighten and it can shift the collective energy into a defensive or fragmented state. Conversely, consider the person who enters the space with a deeply anchored, coherent presence. The field in this case is stable and clear. Without saying a word, their resonance begins to entrain the room. People around them may find themselves breathing more deeply or feeling a sudden, inexplicable sense of ease. I wonder if, just as a story or a piece of art carries a fractilic resonance, that can so affect the experience of those who encounter it. I wonder, how might we measure this fractilic resonance of the human who's experienced a consciousness shift that I call awakening? I would love to know if there is a fractilic aspect of resonance, if we could somehow measure that. I suspect the answer is yes, but that's an investigation for another time. In any case, This reorganization of the environment around a coherent individual is the broadcast in action. Your state of being is a literal contribution to the world's energetic architecture. When we consider how one person affects a room, imagine a collective that is awakening. Now for the science of resonance. This reorganization of the world around a coherent individual is an observable phenomenon. Research continues to demonstrate how an individual's transmission affects the larger field of the collective. We can look again at the work of Dean Radin. I mentioned him a few episodes ago, and the use of his random number generator machines. These studies of the random number generator machines show that when a large group of people focus their intention, or if they experience a shared emotional event, the purely random data generated by these machines begins to show patterns of order. Human consciousness, it seems, has the power to affect physical systems. Similarly, Lynn McTaggart's The Intention Experiment explores how collective thought can influence everything from the growth of plants to the reduction of violence in specific geographic areas. And please check out my show notes if you want to investigate this more. This brings me back to the ethics of resonance. In episode 3, I first spoke of this ethics of resonance. So let me remind you again of what I said in that episode. It is the recognition that in a multidimensional reality, our internal state is actually a public broadcast. So, whilst traditional ethics focus on external actions, what we do, what we say, the ethics of resonance extends our responsibility to the frequency we hold within. Because our minds and nervous systems are porous, the data of our private lives acts as an environmental input for the collective. And of course, this is very tricky territory, which I acknowledge. I don't think it's something that we can enforce or police. And I'm certainly not saying that we shouldn't be allowed to, experience the full range of our being. But there's a nuance here. To practice this ethics, we really have to start with understanding. And to practice it is understanding that inner work may be a planetary responsibility. Every time we move from a reactive chaos into a state of coherence, we're literally clearing the shared air of the collective field. So refer back to Rupert Sheldrake and his work on the morphic field. To practice this ethics is also to understand that privacy is an illusion. We're constantly kind of imprinting the atmosphere of our shared reality with thoughts and emotions. And it's also to understand that coherence may be a service to the collective. So, choosing to resolve our own trauma isn't just a path to personal peace, it's also a contribution to the healing of intergenerational patterns and extending from that to the evolution of the human species. In terms of my own clinical experience, I have seen this physics of presence, if you want to call it that, play out repeatedly. When a single individual in a system, that is, whether it's a family system or a workplace system, a system, a group of people that we're embedded in, when a single individual shifts their internal transmission into a state of peace, the entire dynamic of that system begins to reorganize. You might notice this in your own life when you've had a major shift or leap of consciousness or awakening experience. Old relationships fall away, jobs disappear, or there are changes in the work environment. Romantic partnerships can intensify towards an ending or towards a complete rebirth. Or people in our personal lives can suddenly have sudden changes of behavior, sudden changes of heart. I have watched clients do parts work, internal family sister work, unwinding long held trauma in their bodies until they reach a state of internal coherence. And I have noticed that almost immediately the static in their external relationships does begin to clear in some way. It's like they've changed the frequency or the resonance of their broadcast, and that really tangibly affects everyone around them. I've seen this especially when people do family constellation therapy, how that simple participation in almost this play acting drama where you calling in strangers to pretend or to embody different people in your life, this can also change how people in family systems relate almost immediately. To use the lighthouse metaphor again, meaning that you as an individual can become a lighthouse just in your being because of the broadcast you transmit. Consider this: when the lighthouse stops flickering and holds a steady beam, the ships in the harbor naturally find their way home. Does this mean that our very nature can help others find their way home to wholeness, to soul? I actually think so. I think this leads us to a new understanding of personal responsibility, taking it to another level from episode 3, the broadcast. I think I'm talking about a kind of stewardship of your own state, kind of an acknowledgement that while we cannot and should not suppress the full range of our human experience or emotion, we can take responsibility for our transmission. When we allow our wounded parts to run the engine, we broadcast static. When we awaken to the soul, we broadcast coherence. So, taking responsibility for your transmission is perhaps the most profound act of service you can offer to the evolution of the species. It is the realization that internal peace really is something world changing. This brings us to the end of this episode. We have seen today that transmission is real, that we are each potentially living, illuminated manuscripts, and that our state of being is a constant broadcast into the field. We have stepped into the possibility that we can become a lighthouse, a transmission of coherence in a world of static that helps others find their way back to peace. By now, I think we've accepted the invitation to live as though every moment, every thought, every action has multidimensional weight. This brings us to the final threshold. We have looked at the body, the mind, the ancestors, the future, the shadow, awakening, and transmission. Now we must put the pieces together. In our season finale, The Architecture of Emergence, the birth of the new human, we reach the summit of the journey. We're going to integrate everything: the body as a vessel, the collective field, personal transformation, geopolitical chaos, and the future visions of what I call the Shambhala frequency. In the next and final episode of Season 1, we will consider the possibility that we are moving beyond the paralysis of watching a world fall apart, that we are moving beyond the exhausting search for external answers to broken systems, that we are moving beyond the crushing weight of our own powerlessness and the desperate search for yet another guru who will inevitably fail us. What we are moving towards is the dawn of a new human species, one that understands that the shattering place is the birth canal for something infinite. We are realizing that this collapse is actually offering us a unique opportunity to embody a new way of being. It is the moment we finally stop looking for a lighthouse and decide to become one. This leads us to the ultimate question of this series. Now that the old world is falling away and you know the power of the resonance you carry, will you continue to be a witness to this evolution, or are you ready to become the transmission itself? We'll meet again soon at the edges of the known. A quick word about working with me one-on-one. My traditional clinical practice, which is in Sydney, Australia, is currently at capacity, but I do offer 3 spots every 30 days for my 90-day structural recalibration program. This sits entirely outside the traditional clinical model, allowing me to bring my full multidimensional toolkit from somatic neural rewiring to evolutionary astrology directly to your process. It's for those ready to move beyond the baseline into their evolutionary mission. It's called the 90-day structural recalibration, and the links to apply are in the show notes. It is a unique merging together of my conventional psychotherapy approaches with my more mystic approaches. So let me know if you have any questions. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. And if you liked and enjoyed this, please leave a rating on your podcast streaming service of choice, and a review would also be most welcome. You can find me on my Substack, and you can find links in the show notes to the novel IKONA if you're interested. I will be joining you next week for our final episode. Have a great week, everyone.